Everyone, we'll get started in just a minute. All right, guys, welcome. We're going to start just a minute. All right, while we wait for some people to trickle in more, let me just welcome you and thank you for joining today. And I'll just briefly introduce myself. I am Fallon, and I'm going to be hosting here today, which means I'll be checking out your questions and introducing the company. So I'm the technical writer here at DISQO, and I've worked extensively on API documentation. And currently for DISQO, I build and manage our internal and external documentation, as well as the world blog, which is at developer.disco.com. So let me tell you a little bit about DISQO. So we deliver data and analytics to the market research industry. And we do this through a consumer insights platform called Survey Junkie. And you can check out surveyjunkie.com. That's our platform. We were founded in 2015, and our headquarter office is in Los Angeles, California. But we also have offices in Armenia and other parts of the US. But that said, we do hire globally. So location is not a problem. Let me tell you a little bit now about DISQO Tech. And it's like it sounds, it's the engineering side of our company. And you can learn a bit more about it by going to developer.disco.com. And that's where we have our events listed, like this webinar, but also our blog. So you can keep checking. We post right now about once a month, and we also post on LinkedIn, so you'll be able to see the new content that's coming out. So before we get started with the presentation portion, I want to let you know that this is actually meant to be an interactive webinar. So you're more than welcome, and we really encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see it. And type in questions at any time, and if I can answer them, I'll do that. Otherwise, we're going to save them till the end, and Mark will be able to answer them for you. So now I'm going to hand it off to Mark, and he's going to tell you a bit more about himself and get started.
I love the confidence with which you're sure that I'll be able to answer the questions. That being said, hi everyone. Thanks for coming and welcome to my webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the transition from monoliths to microservices. It's a pretty common topic, but one where I still see some confusion. So without any further ado, let's get started. First, a little bit about me. My name is Mark Bittner. I'm Director of Platform Security and IT at our lovely company called DISQO. In the past, I've worked at some notable organizations, including Lifetime Fitness, Grindr, Ring, and Amazon. And most importantly, for our purposes here today, I've worked with microservices at all of those companies. I wanted to start with some wisdom from a relatively well-known webcomic called XKCD that I think captures where the microservice discussion gets ahead of itself. In the comic, you can see the speaker at an imaginary conference called HypeCon is announcing that they've determined the exact size of a microservice, which ends up being 10,000 lines of code. Some exposition follows with the obligatory joke, until in the final frame, we see someone in the audience exclaiming that he realizes he's been doing microservices wrong all along, which in turn prompts the person sitting beside him to respond that what they've actually been doing wrong all along is coming to HypeCon. Now, this is funny, but it touches on something important. There's a real problem with the order of operations in discussions about microservices that leaves us a bit confused. Uh, People come to talks like this one often trying to find out very tactical things, such as how soon they should build a microservice or what the exact scope of microservices should be. And those are valuable questions, and we can talk about all of them. But if we start with first principles and we understand why we want to create microservices at all, then the conversation about how and what becomes much more productive. So that's the first question we're going to look at today. Specifically, why would I build a microservice architecture in the first place? And the answer, of course, except in the rarest cases, is that microservices are a reaction. Somehow we began with a monolith, and in the fullness of time, that monolith failed to meet our needs. And so you can then reapply the same kind of logic and ask, well, okay, what do we mean by monolith, and how did we end up with one? In the first place, as an overly broad definition, I propose that a monolith is an application built as a single unit with all of its functions committed to a single repository. And how the monolith came to be is fairly predictable. When you start your company, your first concern is always time to market, because delivering your MVP is how you get to all important things like funding. So you build your monolithic application because that's the least complex finish line. A unified code base not only focuses where we do our work, but it also simplifies things like testing and logging and performance monitoring. And this arrangement works really well for a while. But then over time, a curious thing happens. You add more engineers and more resources, but your productivity starts to diminish, often gradually at first, and then as time goes on in more and more dramatic ways. And this was exactly the situation when DISQO began building microservices. We had the kind of monolithic application I've described, which quite literally we've used to found our business. Everyone was committing to the same code base. And as a consequence, releases were the kind of slow, painful affair that I'm sure many here have witnessed, where you end up with most or all of the engineers at a company on the same release call. And yet, at the same time, any change, almost, no matter how small, required a release. The complexity of setting the monolith up locally and the size of the data sets involved made problems so difficult to reproduce that debugging became more of an art than a science. And the strain on our teams was pretty immense. You want your engineers to reach a place where they feel confident introducing changes. But that's a tall order when they have to sort of grapple with a code base that's exceeded 45,000 lines. And as a kind of awful cherry on top, all of this drove up the time that it took us to onboard engineers. So the time-honored strategy of sort of hiring your way out of a throughput deficit was also pretty dicey. All of this isn't just another way of saying that this was fine in the least fine way you can imagine. Product was frustrated because they couldn't ship features. Engineers were frustrated because they couldn't solve problems. We'd become the crazy dog in the meme, sipping his tea, trying to ship our releases as the flames lapped at the walls. However, unlike that dog, we realized that something had to change. So we set out to find a better approach. And when we did, we realized that microservices were the hero we needed. This is actually a story that's been told sort of over and over again as different companies have grappled with the evolution of their software development process, because microservices specifically address the pain points that we just talked about. To understand how, let's talk a little bit about how the structure of microservices differs from a monolith. You can imagine the code modules in a monolithic application as compartments on a train. They serve different functions, like dining or seating, but they're coupled together tightly as a single unit. So there's no way for you to shut down a particular compartment for maintenance without taking the whole train out of service. And if any compartment, for example, has a critical failure, you end up with a proverbial train wreck. You've optimized to reduce complexity, but you can't support the processes and flexibility needed for a highly available service. And in a world where revenue is often tied to availability, it's certainly not where you want to be. So when you transition to a microservices architecture, it's as though you take each of these compartments and rebuild it into an individual car driving down a shared highway. Uh, each service functions independently and in parallel, and the advantages of microservices stem directly from this design. As a consequence of this transition, a number of positive things start to happen. We often talk of microservices as being built for a narrow scope. And scope of responsibility, in fact, is really the way in which microservices are micro rather than, say, number of endpoints or lines of code. This means that each service can be tailored towards the job it performs. To continue with our metaphor, if our service is a fleet of cars, we might build a Ferrari where we need fast acceleration, but we'd build something more like an F-150 where we needed to carry heavy loads. Overall, this means that our services will have fewer lines of code than an application whose scope is all the scope in the universe. But it also allows your engineers to specialize. The mechanic who works on your Ferrari can concentrate on what makes Ferrari special, instead of also having to worry about pickups and station wagons. Likewise, we often speak of microservices as being loosely coupled. Uh, on a basic level, this means you can avoid the kind of train wrecks I described earlier, since any given service can fail independently without necessarily disrupting the other parts of the system. Uh, but it also means that our fleet of services has an independent life cycle. Each member can scale and be released individually and can even actually be written in different frameworks or languages. Finally, microservices communicate using standard, well-documented protocols. And sort of 90% of the time, that's just a code to say HTTP-based REST. Again, though, continuing with our metaphor, you can imagine that the messages in the monolith are like envelopes being passed up and down the train compartments. Unfortunately, that means that if you want to see what's going on, you effectively have to climb into the train. Once you transition to a fleet of independent services, it's more akin to each of the drivers of the individual cars communicating with each other via radio or CB. And because you as an outside observer can actually intercept those messages as they fly through the air, you can sort of more easily isolate what's happening in your distributed system. Of course, what really matters are the results, the things that this has empowered us to achieve, or to achieve. DISQO is well into our microservices transition at this point, and we're already seeing the benefits. Obviously, we've relieved the pressure of long ago of the situation described earlier, but even still, we're seeing an increase in how quickly teams can iterate and release features. And so features get to production more quickly, and we have greater operational resilience. And this is all a way of saying that our engineering org has a better quality of life, which sort of transitions into a key point that microservice adoption isn't purely driven by technical virtues per se. Generally, it's driven by the way in which those technical merits allow us to further scale the number of teams that can work on our service and the speed in which they're able to do so, or with which they're able to do so. And I think in this context, there's a very telling data point where one of our engineers who now works on microservices, had to transition for a time back to working exclusively on the monolith. And in sort of very short order, this individual was literally counting the days until they could go back and begin working with microservices again. I think that anecdote speaks pretty powerfully to even the individual benefit this pattern has for our engineers and their teams. So as I move towards closing, I wanted to touch on a question that frequently comes up as a sort of transition into the broader discussion. Very frequently, people ask, well, when do we start? Like, where do we begin? When do we begin decomposing the monolith? And the problem is it's sort of difficult. There's no hard and fast rule. You have to weigh the cost of sort of cultural and technological shift that you're making against how badly your velocity is being impaired. The word of caution I'd add, though, is that generally organizations wait a bit too long. It seems as though something you can continue to put off and put off, just another day or another month or another sprint, until all of a sudden your velocity is so low that it's an emergency, which then further complicates actually making the transition. So in closing, I would sum things up as blah, blah, microservices, blah, blah, and invite you to join me either now or later in continuing the discussion with some of my contact information here. With that, I will pass the metaphorical mic back to Fallon.
Thank you. Let's get into some questions. So we got some that rolled in, and I'm sorry if I pronounce anybody's name incorrectly. We have an awesome question from Abhijit, and they ask, how do you prevent microservices from turning into monoliths? And do you keep decomposing them into more microservices? That's a good question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the irony is that you see that a little too frequently. And I mean, but there's no, I don't know how you answer that in a broad way, because it's like saying, like, okay, like what mechanism do you use to maintain your architectural discipline? Yeah, sort of. I guess there's a different way of framing it. The thing that you may want to think about, if you've shattered your monolith into microservices and you're seeing the teams put pressure on themselves to slowly rebuild monoliths, I'd suggest there's something unhealthy somewhere else. Like because people start to build fat code libraries or start to build monoliths when they struggle to trust either their ability to see or their ability to use the rest of the distributed system, right? So a lot of times that's a reaction to something that's a little bit dysfunctional elsewhere. So you may want to sort of drill down and see, like, okay, like do people not have visibility? Can they not see what's going on in the system? And consequently, they want their own service to take on a greater and greater role.
Okay, great. And if you have any follow-up questions to any of these discussion points, please do feel free to add them to the Q&A modal. Let's move on. What are the differences between web service and microservices?
Again, I don't know if I have a textbook correct answer to this. I don't. Web service is more class of service. You're basically, again, strict definition, and someone will, of course, later prove me wrong. But to my mind, web services usually just means that, hey, I'm serving up HTTP. I have a presentation layer that I am providing to clients. Whereas, they share the word service, so to speak, but really you're talking about a different class of or different categories, right? Microservice versus monolith is talking about, like, okay, what's our architectural pattern here? Whereas web service is sort of implying, okay, what's my function as a service?
Okay, great. Let's see. In the comic, they were defining microservices by lines of code. How would you define it in a way that a CFO would understand and approve resources for?
You're asking me to be a CFO whisperer. So a way to look at this is that, again, you have to always look at the business value involved, right? You probably want if you're considering a microservices undertaking, there's probably a problem you're trying to solve, and that problem's probably already quantifiable. Before you commit the level of resources that you need to bring before a CFO, you probably want to reach out or sort of like, arrange a Tiger team or a POC, a Tiger team to create a POC, and get a sort of demonstration off the ground, and then you can use that as a springboard into saying like, well, okay, we have this quantifiable problem. We know that I don't know, we need to ship releases faster, or we need to iterate more quickly. But on the other hand, we've been able to measure that it took this amount of time in a very narrow context to produce a microservice, that we chipped off of, a monolith. Then you can extrapolate, right? Then you can say like, well, okay, if we, the cost of this transition from A to B is going to be like, do some napkin math, multiply by the number of services you need to chip off. And then you can sort of sit down and weigh the cost of the transition against what you're trying to achieve. And I think that that's language that most CFOs will understand.
Perfect. Let's see. Miriam, sorry again if I'm pronouncing names incorrectly. Has the technology stack become more diverse with adopting microservices architecture from your practice? What are the biggest pros and cons?
Well, I mean, it almost always does. I mean, the answer is yes, because I mean, in a monolithic application, it's sort of by definition, unless you do something very clever or unusual, you'll have uniformity within the language you're working with at least, which generally limits the interconnections. But yeah, you almost always see once engineers are free, right? You always see a proliferation of like, oh, I want to build this thing in this pet language, or someone else will have another pet language that they like somebody will like Go, somebody will like Rust, another person will like Python. There's nothing sort of wrong with that at a base level, although you do want to, the advantage is that, again, you can build your services to what's the word I'm looking for? Your services can be more focused and tailor built towards the purpose you want them to serve. That also means you can build them using a language that makes more sense for their life cycle or purpose, or even in terms of the publicly published modules, for example. You can reduce the amount of energy it takes. But the danger is lack of focus, right? The danger to your engineering practice is that the more when you're adding complexity, right? Every time you add another language, you're adding complexity and reducing the impact of the tools you already built. And there's a balance there that each organization sort of has to draw. Obviously, if you throw in everything in the kitchen sink, all of a sudden, nothing is reproducible. Whereas if you're being very rigid, then again, people don't have the freedom to innovate.
Okay, great. Judy Sale asks, what are challenges you've often faced when building microservices or working in microservices architecture?
I mean, it's hard to generalize. I mean, I'm sure I can, but again, because the microservices are, when you look at a monolith, right? Like you're talking about the abstraction of just every end-tier application on Earth, right? They're all, they all have a persistence layer. They all have a presentation layer. They all have business logic. And it's all going to be wrapped up there. Microservices are a little more individual, so the problems you see with them are a little more individualized. I think that one of the most common things that comes up sort of right on the heels of a transition is you're introducing a lot of complexity. You're literally sacrificing simplicity for the sake of operational resilience and operational agility. As a consequence, like you have to compensate for that, and the compensation is usually in the realm of you need to sort of drive greater observability, right? You now have a gazillion messages and a gazillion logs flowing between services or within services, and you need to rein that in somehow. And so if there isn't some way to sort of manage that horizontal concern, the level of complexity can sort of spiral out of control. Again, I think to the earlier person's point, where people become fearful and they again start rebuilding little, like microliths or little monoliths, because they don't trust that they can know when parts of the rest of the system are working or not, or how they're responding.
Great. And regarding the CFO chat earlier, we just had a chat message from Gloria Johnson, who just said, think of it in terms of output. Simplifying is untangling an org and reducing dependencies. Having a small microservice-oriented team keeps them focused on a deliverable. So instead of one massive roadmap, you have 4 roadmaps. Microservices can't happen in a vacuum and necessitate changes in the way the org thinks about goals, MVPs, roadmaps. So awesome comment there. Moving on to more questions. Let's see. What's an example of when a monolith failed to meet your needs?
Well, I mean, monoliths are terrible listeners. They're not very thoughtful. As just a general rule, they'll always fail to meet your needs. No. But in seriousness, I mean, the whole story here, which again, this is sort of description of DISQO's journey, but I've seen this over and over again. I mean, that's exactly the needs that monoliths tend to fail. I mean, they actually have virtues, right? There's something to be said for focus. There's something to be said for having all of your work in one place. It's generally exactly where we were describing, where you're trying to scale your business and can't, because you can't have this many people or teams working on on an application that one has just that much surface area, and two, sort of in which every piece fails or not together.
Okay, perfect. Are there advantages to having different teams for each microservice over having one big team where members can fluidly move between microservices?
I mean, there are, but that's, how do I put it? That's an operational question. It depends on how your org works, I think. I've seen, I think what we're describing, actually, I'm not sure I remember the exact phrasing. I think what they're saying is, Fallon, could you actually repeat the phrasing of it? I think I might have missed something at the end.
Yeah. Is there an advantage of having different teams for each microservice over having one big team where members quickly move between microservices?
I mean, yes. Anytime you commit a team to a particular narrow scope, they're going to get better and better at that scope, right? Whereas you're asking them to optimize for different things, or you're asking in the case described, right? And I'm being very broad here and abstract, because I think the question is a little broader and abstract. But if you're breaking out a team per microservice, well, then you're saying, like, look, you guys are going to build this thing all day long, every day, 24/7. We never close. That's what you need to get good at, right? If you have a team and you're asking them to sort of fluidly work on a number of microservices, what you're actually implicitly asking them is to get good at building the service pattern, right? You're asking them not to get good at the sort of reason d'etre, the reason for being of a particular service. You're saying, like, well, look, you guys need to get good at stamping these services out. You need to understand how to reproduce this pattern and optimize it for different use cases. Again, both have merits. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish sort of organizationally at a given time.
Perfect. And if there are any follow-up questions where you want to provide more specific information, feel free to. That was from an anonymous attendee. Someone says this is an interesting presentation. Good job, Mark. What is the?
I was aiming for boring, but
oh no!
I missed. It's okay. I'll get over it.
Try a little harder to be more boring.
I know. Next time, how do you practice?
I don't know. The guarantee that the new app broken into microservices will act faster or better? Is there any metric that you measure or some prototype first? because there are a lot of cases that microservices act worse than a monolith. How do you decide what language to pick for new microservices? So
Lots and
multifaceted.
lots of questions. Give me a second to unpack that. I mean, first of all, there are no guarantees. The big risk with any of these adventures is that, and I mean, this is really the risk with any technical initiative, is that you get into it and you realize you're failing to demonstrate or achieve business value in a reasonable time frame, right? So there are no guarantees, but that's your goal to doing this. You have a North Star, and you're like, we believe that we can get there. And ironically, if you're into it and you're finding that happens, well, you need to back off and do something different, right? You need to take a step back and say, like, again, I always come back to the data, right? Like I say it sometimes to my team. Somebody else has almost always solved a problem that you're trying to solve, or a similar problem. And if they haven't, if you're the only person in the world trying to solve this, you really should think carefully about what you're doing, because it means a whole different set of things. But getting back to the question, other organizations for years and years, since this pattern was invented, have used this pattern to solve a specific set of problems. If you get into your implementation and you find that it's not delivering the business value that you need, that you expect it to, then I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that could be, it could be something specific to your use case. It could be something specific to your implementation. Very frequently, it's the sort of culture and mental change of learning to stamp out, of all of the teams learning to make these little independent units rather than work on a big unit, right? Frequently, that takes a little bit of a shift, and people are sitting there like sort of watching their watch as they're like, well, okay, when do we get value? When do we get value? But it's a great question. Fallon, remind me what the pieces of the question that came after that were, because there's so much in that question.
Yeah, they just measure, and then they just noted that sometimes microservices act worse than a monolith.
I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, nothing exists in a vacuum. Like I said, overall, though, microservices have allowed companies to iterate faster, release more quickly. Is there any metric? The metrics you want to use, or whatever metrics you already use to measure business value, right? Your architecture, and in fact, ironically, I think it would be a fallacy if you were measuring business value before, if you're starting with a monolith and you're measuring business value in a different way, and you make a transition, in a certain way, and then you transition and you measure it in a different way, then all of a sudden you're not doing an apples to apples comparison. If what the person means is that, is there a particular metric that you can look at for, like, okay, is I don't even know what you call it. My microservices practice healthy? Is the way in which I'm starting to build these accelerating or gaining momentum? I'm not really sure of one. But again, I'd say not fundamentally different than your normal operational metrics. Like, what are my team's velocity? What's their burn down look like? Are my teams healthy? Are they happy? Are they, producing output? What do my code metrics look like? I mean, these are all things that, DISQO uses sort of uncontroversially to measure sort of not individual, but like team level velocity. And so those would be the questions that you would want to ask if that's what you're trying to measure in the transition.
Okay, perfect. And then the follow-up of that question was, how do you decide what language to pick for new microservices?
So, I mean, that's the funny thing, because engineers get, it's almost become almost theoretical purists about languages, and I always kind of try to take a step back and like, it's really about, we're trying to deliver business value, and so it's an intersection of what the technical merits of the language in particular is, combined with the availability of engineers and its utility within your organization and your pre-existing code base, right? I think this is almost an impossible question to answer without details, right? Without being able to sit down and say, like, well, okay, we've invested in Python, or we have a bunch of people who know C, and so they'll probably lend themselves to Go well. it's going to be like, I don't know how I would go about slicing and dicing that question. But again, it's just about clarity and what you want to achieve, right? There's no, certainly some languages have been used with microservices more frequently or are more commonly thought of in conjunction with microservices. It's a pattern that you realistically can apply to, you know, any language. So, I mean, the answer is whatever language is going to allow you to be successful in this endeavor.
A good answer. Let's see. Abhijit has another question, follow-up question. What are the challenges with monitoring microservices in real time, and how do you address it? I actually just want to plug the developer blog because we have an upcoming article about this. So we're going to go into a lot more depth about how we at DISQO monitor our microservices. So look out for that. But in the meantime, Mark, what is your response to this?
It's challenging. Again, you're increasing, like when you do this, you're increasing surface area on purpose, right? You're saying like, okay, I'm going to deploy a bunch more things. I'm going to, you know, they're all going to have logs. They're all going to have metrics. I'm going to want to do APM on all of them. And so you're multiplying, you know, whereas you're reducing the scope of any of those, if you think of kind of a physics metaphor, probably the absolute surface area increases, even though the surface area of any given object decreases, right? So how do you remediate that? Well, you want to have some kind of, again, I frequently speak of horizontal versus vertical concerns. You want to have some sort of horizontal drive towards observability. You want to ideally, you know, once your sort of undertaking has object permanence and you're not afraid that, you know, the sort of, when people start to believe like, oh, okay, this microservice thing is working, it's going to happen, it's going to keep happening, you probably want to take a step back and say like, well, dear teams, we're going to, you know, this is a lot more things to keep track of. How are we going to do that? And you probably want to start developing like a consistent framework for saying, like, okay, like here's our plug and play way of ensuring this is wired up to our log shipping, and this is wired up to our time series. Because I mean, the danger is that otherwise, again, it happens if you know, teams are resourceful and you want them to be. As a consequence, if you don't give them a standard to drive towards, they'll invent a solution, but they won't necessarily invent the same solution. So what'll happen is you'll end up with all of these microservices with different mechanisms for shipping their logs, or different, you know, even different places where the logs may be. And then you end up again in this sort of observability crisis where, you know, for somebody to sit down in your, you know, in your distributed system and find a path through all of a sudden is extraordinarily hard, right? Because they have to know how to navigate in and out of, you know, I don't know, 5 different managed logging providers, you know, 2 or 3 different proxies, and the whole, you know, if there's no distributed tracing, again, it can be difficult. Now you don't have to get crazy, you just have to come up with some standard patterns.
Okay, great. So for our next question, this is from Edgar, and he says, will microservices be used in the Armenia branch?
I'm unclear about the scope of the question, because it sounds like they're talking about DISQO, and microservices are already in use across our organization. I mean, so again, I don't know how to, and if you're not talking about DISQO, then I have no idea how to, I'm not, you know, since my psychic powers still don't work despite all of my efforts, I don't know how to answer that for a company which isn't our own.
And also, Edgar, you can check out our careers page and learn more about specifically what teams we have in Armenia. And feel free to reach out to anyone at DISQO on LinkedIn and ask them more specific questions in the field that you're interested in. So next one is from an anonymous attendee. They say, how can you tell when a monolith is starting to do more harm than good? It seems like something you can see in hindsight, but how can you recognize it the moment while you're still in it?
I mean, again, answering any, like this is There's no absolute answer in a vacuum. It's all about sort of relative values over time, right? And to my mind, at least, it's all about business value, right? Like the monolith is doing more harm than good when you are throwing people at your development process and it's not scaling, right? Like when you're adding more throughput and instead of speeding up, you're either in the same place or you're slowing down, right? That's and again, you can only see it as a sequence. You can only see it as a time series. Yeah, I think that's. I don't. Beyond that, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there's a better way to answer that except that you just have to look at, like your sort of organizational and team health metrics over time and see like, well, okay, we know we have a model. Is or are we into some kind of wall? And if so, like how close are we?
Awesome. What are the cultural changes involved in switching to microservices?
Oh, this is a common question and one that I never feel like I have an ideal answer for. The sort of bog standard answer is that your organization needs to become more agile. You're going to have, because probably what you're going to do is have more teams, and the teams know how to operate between each other, and they're going to need to iterate amongst themselves. And so you can bring the whole mechanism, so frequently, the more effectively that you bring the whole mechanism of agile project management to bear uh, upon, immediately after this transition, the better off you'll be, because again, you have focus initially, right? Whereas when you move into microservices, you're going to have to get your teams used to uh, depending on each other. And I think that's actually that's a better answer. Is you really have to start looking at how your teams will have good communication, because the different things they're working on are going to have dependencies they're not used to, right? And actually, we saw this a lot where, we started to spin off different teams and different systems into microservices, and when everything's together in a monolith, uh, all the dependencies are right there, right? You don't have another team where you have to be like, oh, okay, I have to let these guys know that the API is going to change because I push this change and their stuff's going to break. I'm not going to hear about it. So really, in addition to having some kind of sort of distributed and iterative project management, I'd say that just anything you can do to foster healthy inter-team communication and encourage it is really what will help pave the way.
Perfect. And then to circle back on Edgar's question, I just want to mention that our teams are global. So the technologies we use are the same in all offices. So you're not just going to see technology silos. And then Vladislav asks, are there any industry approved standards in choosing design pattern for microservices, say for banking or financial service? And this is a question from this person's colleague. Great.
It's fascinating. If there's an absolute industry approval board, I kind of want to go find them. It'd be very interesting. But so I think what they mean, there's, as far as I'm aware, there's no other than sort of compliance frameworks which literally mandate things, but generally aren't. But generally, compliance frameworks aren't mandating your software architecture patterns. They're mandating like security controls and whatnot. There's no sort of governing body saying like banks must do this or hospitals should do this. That being said, you can generalize a little. Trying to think of what the actual phrasing of the question was. No, I mean, but again, it's not about industry standardization here. It's about sort of organizational throughput and organizational standardization. You could make a generalization. I think were specifically mentioned. Financial services frequently, and I'm making a huge generalization here. They have patterns that are more, or they're actually more monolithic, and that's generally a function of the fact that they have to plan things because of their compliance burdens. things have to be planned in a fashion that's more like sort of waterfall project management, right? Like they're on a long, they can't have risk in the system, so they have to make these decisions on long cycles. Consequently, you'll see microservice adoption be not like, you don't not see it there, but you see them be more slow in the uptake. Somewhat similar in hospitals, because again, they have people's lives are at stake, and so they have very high stakes, and they're sort of very high and deliberate planning processes.
Okay, great. Hopefully that answers your question. Lucas asks, do you work with micro front ends, and what is your experience with them if you have?
I'm inclined. It's not sure that I've frequently seen the term, and this could just be my ignorance, right? The term micro front end. I assume that the person asking the question is referring to really just sort of front end application written as a microservice. In which case, the answer would be yes, but it's no. I don't know that it's categorically different from working. Again, the pattern's not. The pattern's about like scope of responsibility, right? Let's build things that, to a small scope of responsibility, let's build lots of them and have them intercommunicate, rather than about the particular responsibility. That being said, if we're talking about front-end development, I think that frequently the current state of front-end development is much more aligned to, and it probably always has been aligned to microservices, or better to microservices than, say, back-end development or some other areas of engineering.
Great. And Lucas, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A section. Let's see. Judicia has another question. What is the difference between SOA and microservice architecture?
Oh, microservice architecture was a sort of outgrowth of SOA. SOA, and it's funny because I'd have to go back to my textbooks to remember the exact definitions. But microservice is really just one expression of SOA. I guess I do have a textbook definition.
Sure, and there we go. Someone asked, from your experience, has a shift to microservices ever led to architecture?
Yes. It depends on what you mean by over-architecturing. If you mean over-engineering, anything that encourages people to engineer things causes them to over-engineer eventually. That's again, if things are being over-engineered, that's about the seniority and the sort of judgment of talk using standard protocols, and that will be the model. So it's almost the opposite of over-engineering.
Okay, great. Abhijit has another question. They say, looking forward to the blog. Thanks. Yay. Agree
Is that
with
a question? Looking forward to the blog?
The question's following. I just wanted
or is the question thanks?
Thanks, question mark.
Thanks.
They say, agree with applying standards for cross-cutting concerns. Does it make sense to have a dedicated microservice for some cross-cutting concerns like logging, or are we introducing a single point of failure? For example, if the logging service is down, no logs will be shipped.
Interesting. It's a very interesting question. But again, I think it's a slightly different category of things that are being compared, right? Introducing sort of cross-cutting patterns is different from saying I'm going to create a horizontal service to introduce it that's a single point of failure. Now, I said the terrible, scary word, single point of failure. It doesn't always mean that's bad, or at least unjustified in some context, right? The resiliency you need with respect to a given service, given set of services, given concern, like it's a business question, right? Like it's literally driven by like, oh, okay, what risk and downtime can I tolerate with respect to this service, right? Like, like what what levels of operational inconsistency can my business withstand? But again, it's not the same thing as sort of promulgating standard patterns. With respect to logging, it's a very interesting question. It just sort of depends on, and again, I'm speaking not in the context of the original question, but like if I were to imagine a new question, it's like, well, if I'm going to create a bottleneck for logging, what are the pros and cons? I mean, the pro is that you can just deploy it one place, right? You might dramatically simplified operational operations, dramatically simplified deployment. The con is, of course, the resiliency, and the answer, you know, the sort of the answer to the question is like, well, I choose it based on, again, what I want. I want to get the most business value for whatever the context of my particular business is that I can with the least amount of stuff. So if I'm providing adequate business value with a monolithic logger, then like do it. But if those logs are so important that, you know, bad things are going to occur if you can't A, find your logs, B, debug live problems when they occur because you can't find your logs, or C, you know, you just keep going. Any of the bad things that happen when you can't find your logs, well, then you need to sort of reconsider that level of operational resiliency. Redundancy is what I meant to say.
Great. We have a question. Are you guys hiring during COVID? Yes, we are hiring. If you go on ahead
Never stop.
If you go to disqo.com, you'll find our careers page, and you can read more about the positions that are open. You can also, again, reach out to us on LinkedIn, and we can guide you in the right direction. But yes, we have a whole careers page. Check it out. We do have a couple more questions, but yes, I wanted to address that. Judy Sale says, when working on microservice architecture, do you always follow the microservice manifesto to 100%?
No, you never follow anything to 100%. You try to, I mean, you do what has to get you there, right? Or I mean, sorry, let me speak more clearly rather than just mumbling verbs. You do what has to be done to get to a point where you're providing business value. One of my pet peeves in microservices design in particular is a thing that you see and I mean, it's one of my pet peeves because I've suffered from it specifically, where what will happen is people start spinning out microservices, and for example, they'll tie them all back to the original monolithic database. My pet term for these is microliths. And the irony is that in that context, you end up with all of the complexity, which is the downside of microservices, without the benefits, because it's still tightly coupled to your monolith. But if that's what you, again, the other side of that is, if that's what you need to get to microservices, if that's your transitional place and you start to get better velocity, you shouldn't shy away from it. So no, I would never, I mean, I hate to make absolutes, because even when I make an absolute, then I'll find out there's some absolute condition in which I would say it. But I don't think you ever follow the pattern or the rules slavishly. You use the rules as a guide to inform, you know, what you're going to do to solve your business needs.
Great. And we have another question that says, what is your advice for securing microservices?
Secure early on. I could talk about this for a long time. It's a topic dear to my heart. You know, it's not, when you're securing a microservice, it's not fundamentally different from securing any kind of service. The difference is you have more of them, and you have more interconnections between them. So you have to start to think about, like, you're still going, you know, you're still thinking in terms of like, okay, what's my security surface area? What are my threat vectors, right? Like, where can I get hit and how badly are those hits? The problem is that you want to think, you know, probably the most useful mental model is to start thinking of, you know, instead of thinking about your individual application, to start thinking about the security of your distributed system, right? Take a step even further back when you're trying to secure, you know, microservices, and say like, okay, I need to think about this not as though like, okay, can this, you know, like am I scrubbing my inputs coming into my presentation layer, right? Am I patched up, here, here, and here? Like, have I exposed a bunch of, communication protocols into my servers that I have? You have those same concerns. You think much more broadly, right? Like wherever I'm deploying this stuff, I have sort of powerful remediation at layer 7 and layer 3, right? Do I have capabilities to pinhole everything coming in and out, both and ideally, when I say every in and out, I mean externally to internally. But then also, do I have the ability to pinhole, inspect, and or transform everything that's flowing between? And frequently, that's sort of service to service. Those service to service controls are the ones that get neglected, right? Like, you end up with what I call this sort of crunchy outside, chewy inside scenario, where you have a strong wall against threats coming in from the outside, but once somebody's in, or if there's, God forbid, an inside threat, all of a sudden everything internal is just like a gooey mess, right? Like, I can jump from any service to the other. There's not good controls around what can talk to other things, like and so if you can, that would be my advice: is one, think broadly, and two, also think internally, right? Like, start to pay attention to those internal messages because they're important.
Great, thank you. And then let's get to our final question before we wrap up in a timely fashion. So Edgar asks, what do you think about artificial intelligence? Will it help you improve microservices?
I have never, until this moment, thought about the application of artificial intelligence to microservices. So this will be a very interesting exercise in me determining what I think about this. I don't want to say no. I don't know what that would look like, right? And I am not an AI expert. There are people, in fact, I'm barely even an AI dabbler. I mean, it's fascinating technology. I think it's very, very cool, but there's people much more qualified than I am to answer this question. That being said, it's hard for me to imagine, I mean, it's the only way I can think about it is me, what does AI do? AI does like super large scale pattern matching. It says like, oh, okay, I have a problem. I can collect giant data sets about this problem, and based on observed outcomes, derive an algorithm that actually produces those outcomes, right? I guess I can sort of imagine a company, or the creation of a company, that somehow could ingest huge amounts of, well, actually, that's sort of, I don't know, service chatter, or metrics about your microservices, and make some kind of predictions about what would make them more efficient, or what would make them more impactful. I feel like this would be a very difficult problem, though, because machine learning, to several conversations I've had this week, is extraordinarily computationally expensive, and training the models isn't a walk in the park, right? It's computationally expensive with respect to training the models, and microservice fleets are different both from business case to business case, and probably even from company to company, just depending on like organizational factors. Conway's law. There's some kind of corollary to Conway's law there, but I don't think it's ever been named. Where however your microservice fleet will somehow mirror your organizational philosophies. So I don't know that it would be easy to make, or even practical to make us an AI solution that would apply to this problem. But I would personally be fascinated to hear any input you had, because it's very, or any proposals anyone had, because it's a fascinating idea.
Great, yeah, good way to end it, with a little bit of mystery and something for all of us to research a little more into. So as we're kind of finishing up, I want to thank everybody for spending time with us today, and I want to remind you that you can always come figure out a little bit more about how we're thinking on developer.disco.com. That's where we have our blog, and you'll also be able to see any upcoming webinars on our page there. And also a reminder that we are still hiring all across the globe. So check out our disco.com careers page and follow us on our different social media outlets to get up to date. And as a final note, just want to let you guys know that you'll be receiving a short survey. We just want to know how we did today so we can improve in the future. And thank you again. that's it. Thanks,
Supposed
Mark.
to, are we supposed to? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.